Two buildings in the village were constructed to add extra electricity to the track. These still stand today. One is the former home of the Bristol Lacquer and Chemical Company, and the other serves as the headquarters of the Roberts Painting Company. What can be called the age of Elijah N. Welch took place from 1850 to 1870. A business genius, he brought back the community from the financial panic of 1857 and prepared the town for the explosion of industry during the Second Industrial Revolution from 1870 to 1900. This was the beginning of our modern era of history, with a change from an agricultural society to a highly industrial economy. As immigration continued from several European countries, a large number settled in the Forestville area. The privileged, more wealthy Yankees of Bristol attempted to restrict the immigrant voting privileges by denying a second voting district. Forestville in 1872 considered secession from Bristol, but instead won these rights by petitioning the state legislature to create a voting district in the village area. Utilizing these voting rights, after this, the village shared equally in political positions and representation. The remainder of Session 5 explored approximately 20 industrial facilities that grew in the Forestville area from its founding in 1833 to the middle of the 20th century. Several of these are spin-offs from the clockmaking days, while many others diversified into other areas to meet the needs of a changing community and world. Many of the village industries achieved successful worldwide markets. Others still exist today outside of Forestville, having been in business for over a century. One interesting fact is that the site of the former Humison Manufacturing Company has served as an industrial area for over 200 years, beginning as early as 1811 with the Boardman Dunbar clock shop. It is still utilized for industrial purposes today. The Bristol Brass and Clock Company, one of the village's first industries, organized in 1850 on Broad Street, survived for 132 years before closing in 1982. Several companies from the past are still contributing today, as their products are desirable collectibles selling at auction and on eBay. These include clock mechanism toys manufactured by the George W. Brown and Company. One of his toys sold for $231,000 at Christie's Park Avenue Gallery. Clocks produced by the Sessions Clock Company on East Main Street beginning in 1903 are also desirable collectibles. Archery equipment made by the Outdoor Sports Company, both on Stafford Avenue and Broad Street, are diligently sought by collectors. Plated German silverware from the American Silver Company, established in 1901, are constantly being sold on eBay. Burner lamps from the Bristol Brass Burner Shop and lanterns from the National Marine Lamp Company, both which were located on the corner of Stafford Avenue and Brook Street, are purchased by collectors. With the rapid increase both in industry and population during the last half of the 19th century, a corresponding need for crucial services was essential, not only for individuals, but also to sustain the community's growth. Since the Civil War time, the population of Bristol and Forestville was growing at an average of 30 to 40% each decade. These would include fire safety, electric lighting, water and sewage services, transportation improvements, and better forms of communication, such as postal, library, newspaper, and telephone services. All of these would be introduced before the beginning of the 20th century. The first recognizable service was that of mail delivery, which would replace the former stagecoach or post rider style of delivery to taverns. On August 13, 1812, Lot Newell was appointed by the President as Bristol's first postmaster. By 1820, the community asked that he be removed because of his poor reputation. George W. Mitchell replaced him, serving for over a decade. The post office in the Bristol Center that most of us remember was built in 1912 and opened on St. Patrick's Day, 1913. It became a victim of redevelopment in the 1960s. The history of mail service within the village will be discussed later in this presentation. The history of fire protection in Forestville can justifiably be traced back to 1845, when 4 major fires devastated the community. This destruction included the Jerome Clock Company on Main Street and the Samuel Terry Clock Shop near Pierce's Bridge on Middle Street. Jerome, Bristol's largest clock manufacturer, moved his entire business to New Haven, a major blow to the local economy. Recognizing the need for fire services, a charter was quickly secured to develop this necessity. Unfortunately, still being a fledgling town, Bristol was not organized sufficiently enough to complete the implementation until 8 years later, when the Bristol Engine and Hose Company No. 1 was established on School Street. This was a private, not public venture, with industrialist Edward Dunbar and merchant Alfonso Barnes spearheading the effort. Business owners and industrialists had grown tired of seeing their physical structures leveled by the ravages of uncontrolled fires. An engine house was constructed, and a used hand pumper, a hose cart, and sufficient hose was purchased. This fire station opened in September of 1853. The hand pumper would be rushed to the scene on foot by volunteer firefighters and later by trained horses. No longer was the old bucket brigade system used. Although this appears quite primitive, over the next 1½ centuries, vast improvements would provide the area with state-of-the-art services. The first Board of Fire Commissioners was appointed in 1871 with 5 members. In 1881, it was expanded to 6 members with 3 villagers, clockmaker Laporte Hubble, and merchants Samuel Bull and Charles Deming appointed as commissioners. This would solidify Forestville's position in acquiring a fire station. The role of the board was to oversee the general operations and need for services, and to appoint chiefs and their assistants. A charter was secured for a Forestville firehouse in 1880. Elijah Welch donated the land and provided the majority of financing for construction. Situated on a corner of Twining Street and Church Avenue, it was named after its benefactor as the Welch Company No. 1. This stood on the site of today's St. Matthew Church Resource Center, which was prior to that the home of Johnny Perfetto, owner of Johnny's Restaurant. Its second floor was utilized for social events, community meetings, and church services. The Welch Company in 1881 purchased the first horse-drawn, steam-driven hose carriage within the community. Purchased from the Hartford Fire Company, this ushered in a new age of technology, providing a nearly endless and powerful stream of water, independent of the prior fatigue and exhaustion of the volunteer firefighters. When a burner shop on the corner of Stafford Avenue and Brook Street burnt, equipment coming from Bristol was no match for the Welch Company's efficiency. Unfortunately, even firehouses were not exempt from destruction by fire. On February 1st, 1894, a group of boys returning from a sleigh ride in Farmington noticed the fire, sounded the alarm, and were able to save the engine and most of the equipment. The building burnt to the ground. It was surmised that a cooking accident by a group of intruders caused the blaze. A new Welch Fire Company No. 1 fire station was built on the present site, with dedication ceremonies occurring on August 29, 1895. The second floor, once again, served as a community center and was utilized for numerous social, civic, and church events and services. It was the District 2 voting center until 1952, served as the Forestville Boys Club from 1948 to 1952, and was the location for elementary school basketball games and graduations. Bristol's first motorized fire truck, the Pope Hartford Auto Chemical Truck, was purchased by the Welch Company in 1908. Fires could not be fought by chemicals when water proved ineffective. In 1912, the Forestville station purchased one of two auto chemical trucks New Departure manufactured, the Hupp Rockwell Auto Fire Truck. Fire services finally became centralized in 1920 when the Gamewell fire alarm system was introduced. 45 fire alarm boxes were mounted on utility poles throughout the city. These were connected to the central headquarters dispatch center. Response time to fires was vastly improved, with a corresponding insurance rate reduction for homeowners because insurance payouts for fires was significantly reduced. Former Fire Commissioner Arthur Farrar spearheaded a citizens movement in 1950 when the city wanted to move the location of the firehouse to the intersection of Pine and Todd Streets. This action by the city was rescinded. In the early 1960s, it became apparent that the Forestville Firehouse, at that time, was inadequate to handle the new and challenging needs and technology of firefighting. A new station at the same site was approved on July 25, 1961. Arthur Farrar, 2nd District Councilman, was a strong impetus in getting this accomplished. While being constructed, the station was housed temporarily for 3 months at the Pine Trailer Court Laundromat on Emmett Street. Forestville's third facility was dedicated on May 26, 1962. Once again, in 1980, the village's fire services were challenged. The Arthur Anderson and Company, the city's chosen efficiency expert, recommended the closure of Engine Company No. 3, saying a savings of $210,000 would transpire. The Forestville Neighborhood Association met and designed strategies to refute this plan. They pointed out that the southeast section of Forestville was rapidly growing and that slower response time could cause loss of property and life, as well as increasing insurance premiums. The neighborhood association even challenged the credentials of the efficiency group, which had never addressed a similar issue. They finally stated that if this was not changed, then in the next election, they would work to vote out of office any supporters of the plan. Once again, the city rescinded further action. It's a little known fact that Forestville at one time had two firehouses for nearly 10 years. In a unique arrangement between municipality and industry, starting in 1919, the 25-man East Bristol Hose Company of the Bristol Brass Hose and Chemical Company No. 5 was located at the Bristol Brass Corporation. One auto chemical truck was housed free of charge at the Brass Company, with round-the-clock staffing being shared equally by city and company employees. Fire services were greatly enhanced in the Forestville area by this arrangement. On June 9, 1935, fireman Edward H. Conlon of Anderson Avenue in Forestville was the first fireman killed in a line of duty when a wall collapsed while he was fighting a fire at the Prince's Market on Riverside Avenue. When the old Forestville firehouse was taken down, the bell from its tower was carefully preserved. Forestville resident Captain Fran Murphy of Engine Company No. 3 was instrumental in designing and maintaining the bell on the site of today's Village Firehouse as a memorial to deceased members of the department. Improvements in communication. Postal services within Forestville started in 1850 when the railroad selected the village center for its station location. Over the next 2 decades, 11 different postmasters were appointed by the president. Beginning in 1869, a succession of long-term appointments began. J. Fayette Douglas, appointed by President Ulysses S. Grant, served from 1869 to 1885. He owned a general store north of the railroad tracks. This would eventually become the Grand Army of the Republic Hall. This organization was comprised of and honored Civil War veterans. The Douglas General Store also sold ice, coal, and wood, as well as doubling as a post office, which was a common occurrence during those times. James F. Holden purchased the Douglas building and store when he became postmaster in 1885. With the exception of 4 years, he served nearly a half-century until his retirement in 1937. He continued the store and post office here for 4 years before moving the Douglas store to a building on Central Street directly across from Broad Street. When this building burnt down, he temporarily moved to the Porter building across the street. When his reconstructed facility was completed, he moved back to the location across from Broad Street. During the early 1920s, federal law required that the post office be separated from general stores. John Garrity, who served as a clerk for Holden, purchased the building in 1923 and built an addition. The north part at 154 Central Street would be utilized as a second-class post office, while Garrity's store would be located at the south end. During the 1930s, the post office was relocated to 195 Central Street, directly across from the eventual site of the Forestville Boys Club. Owned by grocer Steve Bynowski, the post office remained here until 1955. John J. Kaiser succeeded James Holden as postmaster on March 11, 1937. December 31st, 1938 must have been a sad day in the village when the independent Forestville post office was closed, becoming a discontinued post office. The next day, it reopened as a substation of Bristol. Kaiser was no longer postmaster, but instead became superintendent of the Forestville branch. He served until April 1st, 1953, when John J. Crowley became superintendent. In 1942, a new 1,200 square foot post office was recommended by the U.S. Post Office Department. This was delayed by World War II, but Congress in 1946 approved its construction as one of 65 new facilities nationwide. Housing shortages and construction after the war became financial priorities and again delayed this project. The early 1950s seemed to be a time when village institutions such as fire protection and postal services were being challenged. Forestville's mail was delivered by 6 carriers, 3 stationed at the village substation and 3 at Bristol. In 1952, the Bristol Post Office, authorized by the U.S. Postal Department, wanted all 6 carriers situated in their facility. This would make it extremely easy to close the village substation. The Forestville Citizens Committee was formed to resist this proposal. The 10-person committee was led by Reverend Richard Pearson of the Bethesda Lutheran Church. Philip Jasalowitz, A. Leroy Anderson, and Harold Daly were also members of the committee. A petition protesting the move was sent to all Connecticut U.S. senators and congressmen. They all agreed that they would not support the move and would ask the Postal Department to drop this action. Congressman Abraham Ribicoff responded to the committee, stating, "I know your Forestville area and the deep feelings its residents have. It would seem to me that you should be entitled to keep your post office." The move was rescinded, and on March 24, 1955, it was announced that a new post office with the original plans in place would be situated in a new facility owned by Spartacus Carpenter on East Main Street. The post office signed a 10-year lease. Forestville Library Services. Signs of ancient attempts to create collections of books to be loaned for public use can be traced back as far as the New Cambridge Ecclesiastical Society in the late 1700s. However, the creation of the modern-day library system within our community truly had its beginning in 1891 when the town voted to create a free public library. This was established the next year on the second floor of the Eber building on North Main Street. Charles L. Wooding would become its first permanent full-time librarian. He can certainly be credited with beginning and developing what is now the modern era of services. Through the generosity of 2 out-of-town former residents who donated $5,000 each for library services. A house on the corner of Main and High Streets was purchased in 1896 as a more permanent library facility. As the population increased, there was a need for a larger, more modern building. In 1905, a public appeal for funding commenced. Due to its success, a new library designed by Wilson Potter, a famous New York architect, was opened in 1907. Shortly after the opening, a tragic auto accident, one of the first major incidents in the country, killed 4 local citizens at a railroad crossing in Ashley Falls, Massachusetts. Mary Root, a local library patron with a meager bank account, survived the other 3 in an unconscious state for several days. Their estates vested to her as sole survivor before her death. When she passed away several days after the accident, her estate accrued to $43,000, which was willed to the Bristol Library. The history of library services in Forestville can be traced back to February 6, 1904, when, through the generosity of the Sessions family, the Forestville Library and Reading Room on East Main Street was established. The Sessions family loaned the building, paid for the heat and lights, and also paid the librarian's salary. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the librarian's salary had to be absorbed into the city's budget. This facility continued on East Main Street until November 1st, 1947, when the Sessions family sold the land. Again, through the generosity of the Sessions family, they offered land on the south corner of Circle and Central Streets for a permanent facility. Raymond J. Percival, a local architect, designed the facility, and financing was being arranged. City librarian Celia Critchley at this time convinced Arthur Manross to donate his father's vacant house, which stood on the site of today's Manross Library. He agreed to donate the house and property to the city, requesting that the library be named after his father. Library services opened at this location in 1950. The plans for a library at the corner of Circle and Central Streets were dropped. While the home was being renovated and supplied for library purposes, the Sarah E. Reynolds School Annex was utilized as a temporary part-time facility from 1947 to 1950. Beginning as early as 1960, the former home of F. N. Manross was beginning to show that it could no longer accommodate the needs of the village population. After a number of years, a more modern and larger facility was opened in 1975. Newspaper communication. As the town grew, so did the need for consistent, timely communication. No longer would word of mouth at taverns be adequate for a developing industrial community. The Bristol Press, founded by Reverend Charles H. Riggs, had between 200 and 250 subscribers when its first edition came out on March 9, 1871. This started as a weekly paper published every Friday, later switched to Thursdays. It would herald the town's accomplishments, provide local news, highlight opportunities, announce future events and meetings, and editorialize about significant going-ons within the community. There were other short-lived papers during this time, including the Bristol Journal, Herald, and Times. In December of 1891, the directors of the paper officially organized the Bristol Press Publishing Company. Riggs remained as editor and publisher for the next 2 years when, in 1893, he relinquished the duties of editor to Wallace H. Miller. Arthur S. Barnes, in 1902, was hired as manager of the paper. He acquired most of the stock of the company, thus becoming managing owner. The Bristol Press Publishing Company remained under Barnes family leadership for the next 83 years. The company acquired land on Lower Main Street in 1907 and built a brick building where it not only published the Bristol Press, but also conducted a general printing business, which included such items as programs, pamphlets, and in-town and out-of-town postcards. In 1910, it became a semi-weekly paper, and in 1916 became a daily paper with no Sunday edition. 80 years later, in 1996, it would launch a Sunday edition, the Herald Press. The city of Bristol is still fortunate, after nearly a century and a half, to have the Bristol Press sharing in many ways as it did for 83 years with the Barnes family. Shown in this picture, taken in 1972, are brothers and co-editors E. Bartlett Barnes on the left and Clarkson S. Barnes on the right. E. Bartlett managed most of the business aspects, while Clarkson handled the news and editorial side. They are joined in this picture by their sister, Elizabeth Barnes Alvard. In 2009, present owner Michael Schroeder purchased the Herald of New Britain and the Bristol Press from the financially troubled Journal-Register Publishing Company, who was threatening to shut down operations. Nearly a decade later, Bristol and surrounding communities still embrace having a locally oriented newspaper. Ever since Alexander Graham Bell, on March 10, 1876, said these famous words, "The world and our community have made continuous advances in telephone services." The first commercial telephone exchange in the world occurred in New Haven on September 5, 1878. 3 years later, in 1881, telephone services were established in Bristol by the Connecticut Telephone Company. This company was reorganized in 1882 as the Southern New England Telephone Company. The lines were connected to such major cities as Hartford and Waterbury and were used initially mainly for business and industrial purposes. The phones were primitive, wall-mounted appliances. Dr. Titus Merriman of Maple Street owned the first telephone, and Elijah N. Welch became the second owner, connecting his home and factories. All calls required operator assistance. In 1881, there were 46 subscribers. The next year, 10 additional lines were created. 8 years later, in 1890, there was only 2 additional owners. 10 years later, by 1900, there were 209 customers. Dial service began in 1922 with operator assistance no longer essential. By 1932, the number had increased to 4,000, and an ultra-modern facility opened at 85 Main Street. Lowell, Massachusetts, in 1879 became the first city to assign telephone numbers. Prior to this, the callers had to identify to the operators, known as hello girls or telephone girls, the person or service they wanted to reach. By 1910, four-digit numbers were generally utilized, but in larger cities, the numbers were extended to 5 digits. An operator would generally place the call. As telephone usage increased, a corresponding lengthening of numbers transpired. Around 1930, 7-digit numbers began to appear, including either 3 letters and 4 numbers or 2 letters and 5 numbers. This was a mnemonic solution to people memorizing a long string of numbers. We are all probably familiar with the designation of Ludlow, or LU, within our community, or Sherman, or SH, in Plainville. This was introduced in 1947 and lasted till the early 1960s. When people became familiar with the system, the Ludlow was dropped and a straight 7-digit system was instituted. Rapid increases in usage by a growing population created a need for more numbers, and a 3-digit area code was added during the 1950s. The 860 related to the area code. The 583 related to the central office handling the number, and the 4-digit number referred to the actual line number. A second area code, 203, was added to Connecticut with the increasing number of subscribers. The 860 area now has an overlay of 959 within its region, and the 203 area has an overlay of 475 because of increased need for more numbers. Who remembers party lines? Starting with the first telephone service in 1878, party lines existed with multiple people sharing the same line. After dialing the number, one of 4 letters, J, M, R, or W, was added so that each party received a unique ring pattern of long and short rings specific to them. Party lines were prevalent in large cities, in the expanses of the rural countryside, and were used especially during World War II when available lines were at a premium. The Bristol Forestville area was included within this system. The last party line within Connecticut, in Woodbury, was abandoned in 1991. Rules and regulations were adopted, but were difficult to enforce to prevent eavesdropping, to maintain privacy, and to prevent monopolizing by one party. Although the Bristol Press agitated for water services since 1874, the Bristol Water Department was not chartered by the Connecticut General Assembly until a decade later, in January of 1884. Unlike today's situation, when utilities are established or regulated by municipalities, private investors organize these utilities as profit-making ventures. The town had twice, by referendum, refused to establish water services, led by such names as Hull, Welch, Treadway, Sessions, Burge, Dunbar, and Ingraham. The Bristol Water Department was organized in March of 1884. The mission was to supply water for drinking, fire protection, business and industrial needs, as well as for sewage control, which would eliminate the scourge of typhoid fever. The company would be supported by subscribers mainly located around the built-up area surrounding the center of town. By late summer 1884, the construction of a reservoir was initiated, with pipes laid out the beginning of the next year. Water for public consumption near the center was flowing by September 1885. By 1897, there were 20 miles of pipes, 69 fire hydrants, and 3 reservoirs located in Bristol, Harwinton, and Plymouth, serving the community. Water services to Forestville commenced in the early 1900s. By the 1890s, it was recognized that a 1 square mile area surrounding the center had developed substantial industrial and commercial growth, as well as closely spaced homes, and it was becoming a modern urban area. Public services and sufficient government structures lagged behind this development. Outlying areas away from this developed area were not included within all privately ran utilities and resented any assessments for their support. In 1893, the General Assembly granted a charter for an incorporated borough within Bristol. A warden and burgess, comparable to today's mayor and city council, were elected to conduct a variety of services within this area. The borough included all land inside the border of West, South, East, and Judge Streets. Their duties included many functions such as sidewalk, streets, lighting, police protection, sewers, and public health. Duties not granted to the borough remained with the town government, which also conducted all affairs outside of the borough. The borough officials would tax people separately for services which they supplied. Thus, Bristol from 1893 to 1911 had 2 government structures running its affairs. This obviously caused some discord. The 1,500 Forestville residents, considered outlying citizens, remained under town government control and usually lagged behind in services by a decade or more. Prior to 1910, a disconcerting business control of town affairs was being exerted. At the same time, housing was spreading throughout the town. There was also a perceived need to fully integrate Forestville within affairs. As a consequence, the borough was extended throughout the entire community. Voters at this time authorized the drafting of a charter to make government management more efficient. The charter approved in 1911 established the city of Bristol with a mayor and city council, effectively combining the town and borough governments. The charter, amongst other features, attempted to weaken the private profit-making utilities by assuming municipal control over them, thus taking power away from the Yankee aristocrats and democratically giving it to the city's citizens. On September 13, 1913, exercising its rights, the city of Bristol assumed control of the Bristol Water Department. the Bristol Electric Company, and the Bristol and Plainville Tramway Company. The Bristol Electric Light Company was organized in 1885 and chartered by the State General Assembly in 1886. When the Bristol and Plainville Tramway Company began services in 1895, the lighting company was consolidated into a single utility with the Tramway Company. Many of the same aristocratic, wealthy business owners who had formed the Bristol Water Company as a profit-making venture were owners or members of the board of directors of the Tramway Company. The trolley, also known as the electric railroad or electric train, became the first means of transportation available to all citizens of Bristol. The Bristol and Plainville Tramway Company began service with an excursion to Lake Compounds on August 11, 1895. The next day, it began service between Bristol and Plainville, as well as conducting in-town routes.
All aboard!
Looking at the route from Plainville to Bristol, it first entered Forestville via East Main Street, passing both the Sessions Clock Company and the Forestville Reading Room. It then traveled through the village center to Broad Street with a stop at the Forest House Hotel. It then traveled Broad Street along the Pequabic River, passing Munn's blacksmith shop before continuing to Todd Lot, a private right-of-way. It journeyed through Todd Lot, now Todd Street, to Pine Street. The trolley traveled along Pine Street to the intersection of Middle Street, which was known as the Y. Here you could branch off to either Lake Compounds by way of Lake Avenue or could continue on to the center of Bristol. Trolleys entered Lake Compounds either from Bristol or from the south by way of the Meriden Southington Compounds Tramway Company. The Bristol route traveled north along Middle Street to another right-of-way on the south side of the Pequabic River to the new departure Bell Shop on Down Street. Crossing over a trolley bridge, it connected to Riverside Avenue. Passing both the Bristol Manufacturing Company and the Penfield Saw Works, it arrived at Main Street. Turning right and traveling north, it would turn onto North Main Street. Continuing on North Main Street to Route 6, it would pass both the New Departure Manufacturing Company and the E. Ingraham Clock Shop. Turning east or right onto North Street, it traveled as far as Maple Street on Route 6, known as Doolittle's Corner. It then reversed course and returned to the center of Bristol. A route was later established to Terryville. Starting from the center of town, it ran along School Street, passing Southside School, to Park Street, passing both Muzzey's Field and Rockwell Park. The trolley then continued along Terryville Road to Route 6 to the center of Terryville. A spur line was also established to the Federal Hill area. The trolley traveled north up Main Street, turned onto Summer Street. Traveling along Summer Street, it turned right onto Center Street after passing both the Prospect Methodist Church and the First Bristol High School. From Center Street, it turned onto Maple Street, passing the Federal Hill Green, the First Congregational Church, and the former Thomas H. Patterson School. Turning right at the present American Clock and Watch Museum, it traveled east as far as Oakland Street, then reversing course, returned to the center. Each trolley was manned by a conductor and motorman. The trolleys were housed in an old trolley barn behind today's Webster Bank. This was later replaced with a modernized facility. The route to Lake Compounds closed in 1932 because the automobile was replacing it. Bristol in 1935 was the next to the last city in the state to eliminate trolley services. The trolley company not only provided transportation, but also electricity when it merged with the Bristol Electric Company. In 1921, its name was changed to the Bristol Plainville Light and Power Company. Forestville, still considered country territory, would now finally begin to receive electricity 35 years after the rest of Bristol. Other services provided by the tramway company included sale of gas and steam heat to homes and businesses from 1905 to 1928. The gas tanks were located at the intersection of Riverside Avenue and Blakely Street. The electric company in 1927 merged with the Connecticut Light and Power Company. The tramway portion of the company would be named the Bristol Traction Company. When trolley services were discontinued, the traction company would offer bus services throughout the community, with many former conductors and motormen becoming bus drivers.